I was driving through Montana headed east, and my company had miscalculated my mileage, so I requested an emergency fuel up. I got a response with the nearest gas station that I could get approved at. It wasn't exactly close. So I turned off the main highway and headed toward my stop. It's pitch black. There's no moon, no city light, and I haven't seen any headlights for about an hour. I'm cruising down the highway and I see something in the middle of the road at the furthest extent of my headlights, so I slow down, naturally, as I approach it. When I come to pass it, I get one good glance at it and slam on my brakes as I pass right in the middle of the highway. All I could think was, what did I just see? So I back up looking in my mirror until I see its red silhouette in my brake lights. I pull my brakes, put on my jacket and grab my flashlight and hop out. I walk to the back of my trailer and put my light on it, and there it was. A headless, skinless, mangled corpse. I froze and my jaw dropped. I didn't know what I was looking at. I just stood there, in the middle of the highway, in the cold, stagnant air. The only sound is the hum of my truck 50 feet back, watching the steam rise from this pile of meat. There was no fur, there was no clothing, just a fully intact rib cage with a mess of other miscellaneous bones attached by ligaments. I debated calling the police, as the rib cage looked big enough for someone my size, but I looked at my phone and had zero cell service. The nearest town was about 50 miles out. When I put my phone away, I flashed my light around, and standing at the end of the road were a handful of coyotes staring at me. Then they started coming through the fence and trotting my direction. I figured this is the part where I get back in the truck before I get into a situation, so I did, and continued on my way. I still to this day do not know if it was human or not. Whatever it was, and whatever had happened, I was almost a witness of. I convinced myself that it was more than likely a deer, and was hit by another truck like my own at highway speeds that would definitely do significant damage. But in retrospect, I've never seen roadkill missing its flesh before. My most common run is Vancouver to San Francisco. It's an easy trip most of the time with very little challenge involved. I tend to prefer driving into the night because there's less traffic. Of course, driving around in the middle of nowhere during witching hour means I've seen my share of things. But none of that stuff has ever scared me nearly as bad as the people you see walking along the shoulder of the road far from civilization. I noticed my first one on my junior run down south on the number 5. It was a lady in a blue summer dress, just strolling down the side of the highway underneath the full moon, not a care in the world. Now we were on a stretch that was miles and miles away from anything in either direction, and I was the first vehicle on the road that she'd likely seen since dusk. She didn't even look up to acknowledge me, though. Instead, she just kept on walking with a sort of vacant smile. I chalked it up to some hippie from the Oregon Trail, hopped up on something from a nearby campsite, and kept driving. But she was only the first. It's not every trip you spot them, but sometimes you see a few on a single go. It always struck me as strange because you never seem to see them during the day. Or maybe you do, but they don't stick out as much under the sun. Even so, once you know they're there, you'll start noticing the hell out of them whenever you're driving far from civilization in the dark. The other truckers call them moonwanders, but I prefer shoulder walkers since that's always where they are. Almost like trains on a track, they walk that little white line to wherever they're going. They're different shapes and sizes too. Men, women, tall, fat, ugly, pretty, just folks like you'd see anywhere. Sure, they're creepy, but for a long time I didn't pay them any mind beyond noticing them on occasion in the split second that they were visible as I cruised past. But one night a few months ago, I passed by what looked like an old lady. She was in a hospital gown and looked just like someone on death row. Sunken, given up on life sort of eyes, frizzy white hair and pale skin. She was smiling just like her grandkids had called her name. Her pace was a slow shuffle along the shoulder, and just looking at her, I could imagine the sound of her hospital slippers running just over top the gravelly road. I wanted to keep driving because, well, to be honest, she gave me the willies. But hell, she reminded me of my own sweet grandma, God rest her soul. So I brought my rig to a slow stop and, collecting up the flashlight I keep in my glove box, stepped out of the cab. I could hear her coming before I could see her as I'd driven a few meters ahead of her due to the long stop time. I could visualize her wrinkly feet in those hospital slippers, shuffling ever onward. Quickly, I checked the Maps app on my phone and saw that the closest town to where we were was over 50 miles. No way this old lady was walking that. Putting my phone in my jeans, I held up my flashlight and started walking towards the sound of her footfalls. Hello? Ma'am, I called out, hoping that she would speak up. No such luck, just more scraping. My hairs were on edge now as I waited for her to enter into the dim light of my flashlight. I nearly cried out as the ghostly appearance came into view. Not because anything was different from before, just because she looked so much more sickly up close. Ma'am, are you okay? You're in the middle of nowhere, you know? She didn't say nothing, just kept smiling and moving steadily forward. Now my heart was beating hard. She's just senile. Senile, and she needs my help, I thought out loud. But my feet were frozen in place. They were going back to the truck, or they weren't moving at all. She was getting closer though, and as she reached within 10 feet or so, her wrinkled hands began to reach slowly up. Her fingers wiggled in my direction like a grandma reaching for her grandchild's face. She opened her mouth but didn't say anything, just grinned at me with pale gums. My legs gave out, and as I fell onto my side, she reached down for me with surprising speed and dexterity. Before I knew what was going on, she had her bony fingers around my ankles, and I was getting dragged down the road. Desperately, I pulled back, but her grip was superhuman, and the addition of my weight didn't seem to slow her walk in the least. She stared down at me with those beady, sunken eyes, mouth agape, and a smile. I kicked at her with all the fight I had in me and luckily connected with her jaw. To my horror, it was like kicking solid concrete. But luckily, she let go despite having no visible injury. I crawled backwards towards the middle of the road, and she kept walking down the shoulder. Her hands fell back down to her side, and her mouth closed into a tight-lipped smile. But her gaze stayed locked on mine as she slowly shuffled out of my flashlight's beam. I waited as the scraping bit by bit faded from my ears, and after what ended up being a half hour of stunned silence, I worked up the nerve to get up and go back to my rig. No sign of the lady, but when I climbed into my cab and sped down the highway, it didn't take long to catch up with her. Her eyes were still stuck on me. They probably had been the whole time as she walked away. The last I saw of her as I gunned it away was her thin, chapped, smirking lips. According to some other guys I know, I'm the first to try and interact with a shoulder walker, and if God is good, I'll be the last. Since then, I've seen plenty more, strolling down the highway in the pitch dark. I even saw a kid once, but there ain't no way I'm ever stopping again for them. And if you're smart, you won't neither. Since that night, the shoulder walkers are always looking right at me when I drive past, which they never used to do. Almost like since that old lady saw me, they all did. I'd hate to think what would have happened if I'd not managed to get free. But I can rest easy knowing I've put my warning out there in public. Maybe I'll save a few folks with this story. I was headed from Salt Lake City, Utah to Albuquerque, New Mexico late on a Friday evening. When I got to southern Utah and near the Arizona border, I had gotten tired enough to need to pull over and sleep. I took a county road off of some highway exit, and was driving down it to pull off so that I could sleep without he flights interrupting me or getting woken up by a state trooper and being asked to move along. That can be pretty annoying, and as a person who sleeps in his car a fair amount on road trips to get a few hours before pushing on again, it's just uncomfortable to be woken up. Anyway, the following happened as I'm driving along this county road a few miles away from the highway at about 3 in the morning, and suddenly lights come on right behind me with a vehicle that is very close on my ass. It's a large Dodge truck with a light bar and 4 or 5 hella lights that are shining into my rear view, blinding me. I try to pull over so that they can get around, heart beating and very scared. They pull over behind me, so I take off and try to lose them. But I am in a shiny older Saturn sedan, and they are in a pickup truck with 4-wheel drive on a road they are familiar with. It becomes clear that I'm not going to be able to lose them. They're swerving behind me. They're trying to pull up beside me, and they're flicking their lights. This was a very scary experience. I thought it through and had no idea what road I pulled off of, so calling 911 wouldn't have helped me since I couldn't tell them where to show up to help me. Regardless, this emergency was happening now, and I needed to deal with it. It was a fight or flight situation, and my flight was not working. So, I decided to fight. I always travel with a small weapon of some kind, and what I had between my driver's side door and my seat was a very large hunting knife, so I pulled my e-brake suddenly and slammed to a stop. As soon as my car stopped moving, I got out and started running at the truck, terrified but yelling like I was just fucking insane and ready for battle. They were sliding to a stop behind me and actually almost hit my Saturn by the time that I was almost at their truck. They had thrown it in reverse and were backing up. I could see inside of their truck, and it looked like some teenagers on the bench seat. The look of fright on their faces made me more emboldened, and I roared and yelled and cussed as they spun around and took off. It occurred to me after that, while calming down from a really fucking terrifying experience, that they were just kids out having some fun on a weekend night in a rural area. But to me it really felt like I was being attacked and maybe they were going to try to kill me. I still think back on it with a lot of fear, because it was just a helpless situation, and my only reaction that seemed appropriate was to try to at least hurt them before they killed me. So somewhere out there now 10 years later are a group of young adults in their mid-20s to late 20s who have a crazy story about some redneck who turned the tables on them and charged them with a knife while they were just having a little fun. I worked for a company that owned a Caterpillar bulldozer. It weighed over 100,000 pounds. They had to use a tractor from the 1980s with a drop trailer to move it off the property. Both were functional and as safe as they could be, but had seen better days. They asked me to deliver the bulldozer to another company, and I agreed. We loaded up the dozer, secured it to the trailer, and I was on my way. One of the intersections on this state route is notoriously bad. It's at the base of a hill, and if you're coming from the side the hill is on, you don't see the stoplight or traffic until you get over the peak of the hill. You still usually have plenty of room to stop. As I was approaching this intersection, my CB antenna lit up, and a guy was basically screaming into it for traffic at the peak of this hill to slow down. The problem was that my CB wasn't tuned, and I only caught about every third word. I let off the accelerator when I peaked the hill, mostly because I hated that intersection. I would have had plenty of time to stop, even with the road conditions if traffic was normal. Unfortunately, traffic was not normal. There was a fresh, pretty bad accident at the intersection, and traffic had backed more than halfway up the hill. The accident had just occurred, so there were no emergency services on scene. I now had very little space to stop a very heavy load with a very old truck. I started downshifting and braking, realized I was going to be cutting it very close, and started braking harder. Then I realized I was hitting large ice patches on the road. The tires were slipping and jerking the tractor around. I heard the fifth wheel clanking, and I felt the trailer tugging on the tractor in a weird way. So I looked at my driver's side mirror and didn't see anything, including the dozer. In a panic, I whipped my head around to look out the passenger mirror, and the only thing I saw was the entire side profile of the trailer and dozer. I had made a terrible mistake in letting that trailer get out from behind me. This is it. This is how I die. Moments. I was now jackknifing, while still moving, and still trying to slow the truck down while on an icy hill. I was headed for an intersection full of stopped passenger cars, and my truck weighed a lot. By this point, I was thoroughly convinced that I was about to involuntarily murder a bunch of people. I laid on the horn as much as I could, but I was also trying to work the steering wheel in an attempt to pretend I had control. Honestly, I hit a point where I basically realized I was just a passenger standing on a brake pedal. I didn't have enough room to correct anything, so I just went all out on the horn. The trailer tires finally heated up enough to start making a very loud and deep squeal. There were a bunch of people in front of me that got out and ran away from their cars. They were basically staring at out-of-control death coming down the hill. The truck finally came to a stop within 3 feet of the last car in the intersection. I could sit on my truck's bumper and easily put my feet up on the car's bumper. The truck stopped with the trailer jackknifed, so I was blocking both lanes and the breakdown lane. I was sweating and was shaking from the anxiety. As I was sitting in the now-stopped truck, the people who had abandoned their cars were now screaming at me and pointing up the hill. I looked up the hill to see another tractor, but a tank trailer, basically reliving everything I just had, with much less space to work with due to my trailer blocking so much of the road. I got out of my truck and ran away from it. The second truck slid down, stopped and parallel parked almost perfectly with my truck. Once his truck stopped, I could see he was experiencing the same thing I was. We were both extremely close to being in bad accidents. Thankfully, he was pulling a dry tank. I am pretty sure that's the only reason he was able to stop. He was running much lighter than me. By this time, the guy on the CB got through to enough truckers at the top of the hill that they basically slowed everyone down. Once the adrenaline wore off, I almost passed out. I have operated a lot of different vehicles in my life, and that situation was easily the scariest operating situation I have ever lived. I had zero control of the situation, and that's a bad feeling for an operator. I remember the people that ran away from their cars were comforting me. It's been over 20 years since that happened, and I still get the willies when I think about it. Had I not been able to get that truck to stop, I would have ripped through all those passenger vehicles with little resistance. Another 5 miles per hour, or being in a different lane, just a bit more ice, even the time of day would have completely changed the outcome of that situation. It would have been entirely my fault. Many years ago, I was on a shift called Meet and Turn. This is where the truck driver that is domiciled out of the city will drive a load halfway to its destination, while the other driver that meets him halfway and brings the load where it needs to be delivered. I had been doing runs like these for several months, and I found out that I had to meet on point an hour before the other driver arrived. It was a dark and empty lot around 3 a.m., so since there was still some time to kill, I decided to close my eyes and take a short nap. About 10 minutes into my nap, I was awakened by a barking dog. I tried to ignore it, but the bark carried on for several minutes and it grew louder and closer. At this point, it became clear that he's either trying to alert me of something or he's just being a pain in the butt. So I sat up and looked out my window, and what I saw left me motionless. Standing there, inches on the other side of the glass, was a man around 35 years of age. He was a large fellow, and he was barking at me. His eyes were crazy, and he was even frothing a little from his mouth. The sheer creepiness struck me, and gently, without making any sudden movements, I reached down and started my truck and slowly started pulling away. As I was doing so, he was chasing after me, much like you would expect an angry dog, and still barking as I kept pulling away. Needless to say, I don't take naps on the job anymore.